Every time I hear another joke about how indecipherable Polish spelling is, I feel like shooting up a mall. But my lawyers advise me against it, so instead I'm going to do the responsible thing and teach you how to read it. Unlike my other videos, this one does not assume you have any linguistic knowledge, because if you do, you can just go on Wikipedia. Luckily, reading Polish is rather straightforward due to its predictability. If you see a word written down, you can virtually always tell how it's supposed to be pronounced, barring some loan words. In Polish, letters or letter combinations always make the same sound, so we don't have things such as the English soft and hard G. Another thing that sets Polish apart from English is that vowels are always pronounced the same way, regardless of their position in the word. In English, unstressed vowels are very often reduced, like how this word isn't pronounced professional, but professional. This doesn't happen in Polish. What also doesn't happen are silent letters. If it's written down, it's there for a reason. Finally, in English, stress is not predictable and must be learned on a word-by-word basis, but in Polish it's almost always on the second last syllable of a word. Let's start with vowels, of which there are 6. A, E, I, O, U, I. A is pronounced similarly to the British pronunciation of the vowel in bat, or in some American accents as in time, provided that you skip the y sound. E is pronounced as in bet, and I as in beat. O, once again, resembles a British vowel as in bot, and U is as in boot, and yes, it has 2 possible spellings. If you're wondering why, they used to be 2 different sounds, then they merged, but the old spelling stayed. Finally, I is always a vowel and is very close to the I in bit. One thing Anglophones tend to do is put a y or w sound after their vowels, so a word like this is pronounced as expose. This should be avoided in Polish, so this word sounds like expose. There are also 2 nasal vowels, spelled with these funny tails at the bottom. They sound like a regular o or e, followed by a nasal grunt, like so on and en. More often than not, they end up sounding like on n or m, depending on the following consonant, so kont, pęk, sępy. At the end of a word, en becomes a regular non-nasal e, so tę is pronounced like te, but the same cannot be said about on, so ton is still ton. You might be also thinking, why is the nasal o spelled with an a? Wouldn't it make more sense to spell like this? Yes, it would, but sometimes things don't have to make sense. Moving on to consonants, let's start with the simple ones. These 6 are pronounced the way you would expect them, so p, b, t, d, k, g. In English, p, t, and k are oftentimes very breathy, as in p, t, k, which doesn't happen in Polish, but I wouldn't worry about it impeding communication. It might just sound slightly off to us. These next consonants are pronounced f, v, s, z, c, z, h. One thing to look out for is that W is pronounced like a V, and V is absent from the Polish alphabet altogether. So this name, which you might recognize, is not pronounced Kowalski, but Kowalski. H is another sound that has 2 spellings. If you're wondering why, used to be 2 different sounds, now they're the same. Spellings were never updated. In English, H is only pronounced at the beginning of a syllable and is otherwise silent, but in Polish it's always pronounced, so dach is pronounced with a nice audible H at the end. Finally, we have these consonants, m, n, r, l, w, y. The R is not like the English R, it's more of a tap, like in the American pronunciation of better. It can be rolled, but we're generally way too lazy to do that. You can also just use the English R, we'll still understand, it'll just be blatantly obvious what your native language is. But that's okay. Anglophonia is not curable, but it is treatable. So these were the easy consonants. Let's talk about the not so easy ones. Polish has a contrast between pairs of what we call soft and hard consonants. These are equivalents to the English sh, zh, ch, and j. The English sounds are somewhere in the middle between the 2, with the ones on the left being softer, sh, zh, ch, j, and the ones on the right being harder, sh, zh, ch, j. And yes, zh has 2 spellings. If you want to know why, you get the idea by now. These pairs are notoriously difficult for foreigners to get right, unless you speak Mandarin, which coincidentally happens to have the same contrast. We're used to non-natives mixing them up, so don't feel too bad about it. But if you really want to get them right, this is how you pronounce them, or at least this is how I pronounce them. For the soft sounds, the blade of the tongue is raised to the palate, with the tip facing down and resting behind the lower teeth. For the hard sounds, the tip of the tongue is raised to the palate, and the sides of the tongue are pressing against the upper molars. For a side-by-side comparison, sh, sh, j, zh, ch, ch, j, j. There is an additional soft sound that has no hard equivalent, and that is ñ, the equivalent of the Spanish and tilde. You might have noticed that all of these so-called soft sounds are spelled with an accent. This accent only appears before consonants or at the ends of words, as in śród, czyjś, źródło, maź, ćwiek, iść, dźwięk, kać, tańczyć, koń. Before vowels, the accent is discarded and replaced with the letter I, as in siwy, siano, zima, zieleń, cisza, ciocia, dziwny, wdziać, nic, niósł. After other consonants, I before a vowel is pronounced as a y, as in wiedza, mięso, kiedy. The letter J can also be used in this context, but generally only after consonants that can get softened, as in misja, wizja, sankcja. Finally, when consonants occur together in clusters, their pronunciation can sometimes change. This excludes clusters containing these consonants. All other consonants can be divided into voiceless and voiced pairs. Voice just means that your vocal folds vibrate when you produce the consonant. These two sets don't like each other, so all consonants occurring next to each other can only belong to one of the sets. This is determined by the final consonant in the cluster, giving us examples such as kawka, także, wsadzić. But there are two exceptions, w and ż, spelled as rz, so we get kwiat and krzak, not gwiat and grzak. This is particularly important because the sequences przy, trzy, krzy are quite common. Another thing is that voiced consonants at the ends of words turn voiceless because we're lazy, so these words are pronounced as buk, wjazd, hut. And that's basically all there is to it. Let's test it out on a few example sentences. Czarnobyl? Nie, jesteśmy w Bydgoszczy. We're starting with a pretty straightforward example. Note the soft consonant spelled with an I before a vowel, and another spelled with an accent before a consonant. You can also see the infamous SZCZ cluster, but it's nothing more than a combination of sz followed by ch. Jeremiaszu, czy przygotowałeś generator brukowca? Let's look at some clusters. We see a voiced v followed by a voiceless c. The final consonant determines the voicing, so v changes to f, brukowca. However, in this case we have an RZ, which is one of the two exceptions, which means the preceding p causes RZ to be pronounced as sz, przygotowałeś. We also see an example of I pronounced as y before a vowel, Jeremiaszu. Prędzej będę 2 metry pod ziemią, niż bym miał donieść na kogoś o uchylanie się od podatków. We have some nasal vowels here. N is fully nasalized in the middle of a word, prędzej, but is pronounced as a regular e at the end, będę. However, on is always nasalized, ziemią. Remember that o with an accent is pronounced as u, and final v devoices to f, podatków. The same happens in the previous word, od. Finally, we see another example of a soft consonant spelled with an accent before a consonant, donieść, and word finally, kogoś, but with an I before a vowel, się. So as you can see, the language is pretty easy to read. I never said, however, that it was easy to pronounce, so good luck, bozo.